I stared at the Chase Sapphire statement in my trembling hands, the numbers blurring through my tears. $95,000. Nearly $100,000 charged to credit cards I never opened, for purchases I never made, funding a lifestyle I could never afford. But the most devastating part wasn't the money. It was discovering that every romantic gesture, every "I love you," every promise of forever, had been a calculated lie designed to steal my identity and fund his ex-girlfriend's luxury lifestyle. When I confronted Ryan about the fraud, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Jessica deserves better than what I could give her on my salary alone. You were just convenient." But he had no idea that his confession was being recorded, and he certainly didn't know what I was capable of when pushed to my breaking point. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in Denver. I was rushing around our shared apartment in Capitol Hill, trying to get ready for another day teaching second graders at Pine Valley Elementary. Ryan had already left for his job at Summit Properties, leaving behind the familiar scent of his cologne and a coffee mug in the sink. We'd been together for 3 years, engaged for 6 months, and I thought I knew everything about the man I was planning to marry. I was grabbing my purse when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was professional but concerned, a fraud prevention specialist from Chase Bank. "Ma'am, we're calling about some unusual activity on your Sapphire card. We're seeing charges in amounts that seem inconsistent with your typical spending patterns. Large purchases at luxury retailers, expensive restaurants, and what appears to be travel bookings." My blood ran cold. "I don't have a Sapphire card," I told her, my voice barely above a whisper. There must be some mistake. The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long before she spoke again. "Mrs. Collins, according to our records, this account was opened 18 months ago, with your social security number and address. You're listed as the primary cardholder." The room began to spin as I sank onto our second-hand couch. 18 months ago, that was right around the time Ryan and I had started talking seriously about our future together. He'd been helping me organize my finances, had access to all my personal documents for our joint apartment application. The fraud specialist continued explaining the charges while I sat in stunned silence, each purchase hitting me like a physical blow. March 15th, Nordstrom, $4,000. March 20th, the Ritz-Carlton Bali, $8,000 for a week-long stay. April 2nd, Tiffany & Co., $6,000. The list went on, painting a picture of someone living a life of luxury that I could never afford on my teacher's salary. Someone who was clearly not me. After I hung up, I immediately called American Express and Capital One, my hands shaking as I dialed. The story was the same. Cards opened in my name, massive balances, purchases I'd never made. In total, across 3 different credit cards, someone had racked up $95,000 in debt using my identity. The amount was staggering, more than twice my annual salary, enough to destroy my credit and my future. I called in sick to work, something I'd never done unless I was genuinely ill, and spent the rest of the morning on the phone with fraud departments and credit agencies. Each conversation revealed more devastating details. The applications had been submitted online using my personal information, but with a different email address, one I'd never seen before. The billing statements were being sent to a P.O. box across town. Whoever did this had been meticulous, careful, and had intimate knowledge of my personal details. As I sat surrounded by printouts and notes, trying to piece together the timeline of the fraud, a terrible suspicion began to form in my mind. Ryan was the only person who had complete access to my social security number, my mother's maiden name, my date of birth, all the information needed to open credit cards in my name. He'd been present when I filled out our apartment application, had helped me organize my tax documents, had even encouraged me to sign up for identity monitoring services, claiming he was worried about data breaches. The identity monitoring. The irony wasn't lost on me now. He'd been so concerned about protecting me from financial fraud while simultaneously committing it himself. I thought about all the times he'd volunteered to handle our financial paperwork, how he'd suggested I let him manage certain bills to simplify our lives together, how trusting I'd been, how grateful for his help with adult responsibilities that sometimes overwhelmed me. I decided to do some investigating of my own before confronting him. Using the email address from the credit card applications, I began searching social media platforms. What I found made my stomach drop to the floor. The email belonged to Jessica Torres, a name that was all too familiar. Ryan's ex-girlfriend, the one he claimed he'd had an amicable breakup with 2 years ago, the one he said he rarely spoke to anymore. Jessica's Instagram account was a showcase of luxury and excess. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, exotic vacations, all posted with timestamps that corresponded exactly to the fraudulent charges on my credit cards. There she was in Bali, wearing what looked like a Tiffany necklace, dining at the same restaurants that appeared on my Chase statement. She was living the life of an influencer, funded entirely by credit cards opened in my name. The more I scrolled through her posts, the sicker I felt. There were subtle hints that she wasn't funding this lifestyle herself. Captions like, "Grateful for the amazing people who make dreams come true," and "feeling blessed by unexpected generosity." But most disturbing were the photos that included men's hands or showed someone else taking the pictures. In several recent posts from Bali, I could clearly see a familiar watch in the corner of the frame, Ryan's vintage Rolex, that I'd helped him pick out for his birthday. He'd been with her. While I was home grading papers and planning our wedding, he'd been in Bali with his ex-girlfriend, funding their romantic getaway with credit cards opened fraudulently in my name. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial theft. This wasn't just about money. It was about the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about our relationship. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering evidence, taking screenshots of Jessica's posts, documenting the timeline of charges, and organizing all the information the credit card companies had provided. By the time Ryan came home that evening, I had built a comprehensive case that would have impressed any detective. I was sitting at our small dining table, surrounded by printouts and my laptop open to Jessica's Instagram page, when I heard his keys in the door. "Hey, babe," he called out cheerfully, completely oblivious to what awaited him. "How was your day?" "Sorry I'm late. Had to show a property to some difficult clients. You know how it is." His casual normalcy in the face of what I'd discovered made my skin crawl. How could he stand there acting like the loving fiancé when he'd been systematically destroying my financial future? "I need to talk to you about something," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Ryan walked into the dining area, loosening his tie, and stopped short when he saw the papers spread across the table. His face went pale as he recognized the credit card statements and Jessica's Instagram photos displayed on my laptop screen. "Emma, I can explain," he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. The explanation I'd been dreading was about to come, and I wanted to hear every word. I also wanted him to know that I'd done my homework, that this wasn't just suspicion or paranoia. "Explain how you opened 3 credit cards in my name without my knowledge," I said, picking up the Chase statement. "Explain how you've been funding your ex-girlfriend's lifestyle to the tune of $95,000 using my identity. Explain how you've been lying to my face for 18 months while systematically committing financial fraud." Ryan sank into the chair across from me, his confident demeanor crumbling. For a moment, I thought I saw genuine remorse in his eyes, and a small part of me hoped he'd break down, apologize, and somehow make this right. Instead, what he said next changed everything I thought I knew about the man I'd planned to marry. "Look, Emma, I never meant for you to find out this way." Ryan ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing but now seemed calculating. Jessica was in a really bad place financially when we reconnected. She was about to lose her apartment, couldn't make her car payments. I just wanted to help her get back on her feet. The casualness of his confession was almost more shocking than the crime itself. He was talking about identity theft and fraud as if it were a favor he'd done for a friend, completely ignoring the devastating impact on my life and future. "You wanted to help her, so you decided to steal my identity and destroy my credit," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "It wasn't supposed to be this much," he said defensively. "I thought I could pay it back before you noticed. The real estate market has been slow, and I've been having cash flow problems." I just needed time to get ahead, and then I was going to take care of everything. You would never have known. The delusion in his words was staggering. $95,000 wasn't something you accidentally stumbled into. This was systematic, deliberate fraud that had been going on for over a year. But what hurt most was the complete lack of remorse for what he'd done to me personally. He seemed more concerned about being caught than about the damage he'd caused. And Jessica just happened to need exactly the amount you could steal using my credit, I said, gesturing toward the laptop screen. She just happened to need designer clothes and luxury vacations and expensive jewelry. How convenient for both of you. Ryan's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he'd walked in, I saw anger in his eyes instead of guilt. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, he snapped. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch someone you care about struggle while you can't help them? Jessica has been trying to build her brand, create a career for herself. She needed to maintain a certain image. The words hit me like a slap. Someone you care about. Not his ex-girlfriend, not someone from his past, but someone he currently cared about. Someone whose needs were apparently more important than my financial security or our supposed future together. You care about her, I repeated slowly. More than you care about me, obviously. For a moment, Ryan seemed to realize what he'd revealed. He tried to backtrack, stammering about how that wasn't what he meant, how he loved me and wanted to marry me. But the damage was done. The truth was written all over his face, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. This isn't just about helping an ex-girlfriend, is it? I said, the full picture becoming clear. You're still in love with her. All of this. Our relationship, our engagement, it's been a lie. You've been using me as a convenient source of funding for the woman you actually want to be with. Ryan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Emma, that's not fair. Yes, I still have feelings for Jessica, but that doesn't mean what we have isn't real. I do love you, I want to marry you, we can work through this. The audacity of his words was breathtaking. He'd just admitted to loving another woman while asking me to marry him, all while defending his decision to steal my identity to fund her lifestyle. You want to marry me so you can have legal access to my finances, I said, the truth crystallizing with painful clarity. This was never about love. I was just a convenient target with good credit and a trusting nature. That's when Ryan's mask finally slipped completely. His face hardened, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold and calculating. Look, Emma, let's be realistic here. You're an elementary school teacher in Denver. You're never going to be wealthy, never going to live the kind of life that someone like Jessica deserves. I make good money, but real estate is unpredictable. Jessica has Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Potential, her influence, her connections. She could build something significant if she has the right support. The coldness in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. This wasn't the man who'd proposed to me 6 months ago, who'd talked about building a life together, who'd held me when I cried about my grandmother's death. This was someone else entirely, someone who'd been hiding behind a carefully constructed facade for 3 years. So I was just a stepping stone, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. A way to fund your real relationship while keeping yourself financially stable. How long were you planning to keep this up? Were you actually going to marry me while continuing to steal my identity for her benefit? Ryan shrugged, a gesture so casual and dismissive that it took my breath away. I figured we could make it work for a while. Marriage would have made things easier. Joint accounts? Shared credit? Jessica understood the situation. She knew you were temporary. The room began to spin as the full scope of his betrayal hit me. Not only had he been stealing my identity and destroying my credit, but he'd been planning to marry me under false pretenses to gain even more access to my finances. Jessica had known about me, known that I was being used, and had been perfectly willing to benefit from the fraud. They'd both seen me as nothing more than a convenient victim. I need you to leave, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the chaos in my mind. Right now. Pack whatever you need for tonight and leave. We're done. Ryan's expression shifted again, this time to something resembling panic. Emma, wait. Let's talk about this rationally. We can figure something out. I can pay back the money, Work out a payment plan with the credit card companies. You don't have to blow up our whole relationship over this. The fact that he thought our relationship was salvageable, that identity theft and emotional fraud were just obstacles to work around, showed me exactly who I'd been living with for 3 years. A stranger. A criminal. Someone who saw me as so expendable that he'd built an entire secondary life while planning to marry me. There's nothing to figure out, I said, standing up and walking to the door. You committed fraud. You stole my identity. You've been lying to me for 18 months, while planning to continue lying for however long it suited your purposes. This isn't a relationship problem, Ryan. This is a crime, and I'm going to report it as such. That's when Ryan's demeanor changed completely. The pleading expression disappeared, replaced by something cold and threatening. You really want to go down that road, Emma? You think anyone's going to believe that you had no idea what was happening? We live together. We share everything. You're going to have a hard time proving you weren't complicit in this. The threat hung in the air between us, and for the first time since this conversation started, I felt genuinely afraid. Not just of the financial implications or the legal complications, but of the man standing in my living room. How had I missed this side of him? How had I shared a bed with someone capable of this level of manipulation and cruelty? Get out, I repeated, my hand on the doorknob. Now. Before I call the police and have you arrested for fraud and identity theft. And Ryan? Don't come back. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't contact me in any way. The next time you hear from me, it'll be through my lawyer. As Ryan gathered his things, muttering threats and justifications under his breath, I realized that the woman who'd woken up this morning planning a wedding and a future was gone forever. In her place was someone who'd learned a valuable lesson about trust, about love, and about the lengths some people will go to get what they want. But more importantly, I was someone who was about to learn exactly what she was capable of when pushed beyond her breaking point. After Ryan left, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows, I sat alone in the apartment we'd shared for 2 years. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of traffic from Colfax Avenue. I looked around at the space that had felt like home just hours ago and realized that everything was contaminated now. Every piece of furniture we'd picked out together, every photo on the wall, every shared memory had been built on lies. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. The face staring back at me was that of a stranger. Pale, hollow-eyed, aged by betrayal. But there was something else there too, something I'd never seen before. A hardness around the eyes, a set to the jaw that spoke of determination rather than defeat. The naive schoolteacher who'd trusted blindly was gone. In her place was someone who understood that in a world where people could steal your identity and your future without a second thought, you had to be prepared to fight back. I returned to the dining table and looked at all the evidence I'd gathered. The credit card statements, the social media screenshots, the timeline of fraud. It was comprehensive, damning, and absolutely devastating to anyone who might doubt my story. But as I sat there, I realized that simply reporting the crime and hoping for justice wasn't enough. Ryan and Jessica had stolen more than just money. They'd stolen years of my life, my trust, my faith in love itself. They thought I was just a convenient victim, someone too naive and trusting to fight back effectively. They thought that Emma Collins, elementary school teacher from Capitol Hill, would simply file a police report and disappear into obscurity while they continued their life of luxury. They had no idea what they'd awakened in me, what they'd forced me to become. As I began planning my next moves, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a cold, calculating clarity that cut through the emotional chaos like a knife. They'd underestimated me completely, seen only what they wanted to see, a trusting woman with good credit and a stable income. What they'd failed to recognize was that beneath that exterior was someone with intelligence, resources, and now, most importantly, nothing left to lose. The game was just beginning, and they had no idea that they'd given me every tool I needed to destroy them both. The irony of how Ryan and I met wasn't lost on me now, as I sat in the wreckage of what I'd thought was a perfect relationship. It had been during a financial literacy workshop at the Denver Public Library of all places. I'd been trying to improve my money management skills as a young teacher, determined to build a stable future despite my modest salary. Ryan had been there representing Summit Properties, giving a presentation about real estate as an investment strategy. He had approached me afterward, complimenting my questions about mortgage qualification and down payment strategies. "You're really smart about this stuff," he'd said with that charming smile that I now realized had been carefully calculated. "Most people your age don't think about long-term financial planning." At the time, I'd been flattered by his attention and impressed by his apparent expertise. Our first date had been dinner at Garden Grace, an upscale steakhouse that I'd never been able to afford on my own. Ryan had insisted on paying, brushing off my concerns about the expense. "I believe in investing in things that matter," he'd said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "And getting to know you better definitely matters to me." The gesture had seemed romantic then, but now I understood it as the opening move in a long con. Over the following months, Ryan had systematically inserted himself into every aspect of my financial life. It started small, offering to help me set up a budget spreadsheet, suggesting better banking options, recommending credit monitoring services. He'd presented himself as the financially sophisticated partner who could help elevate my economic situation. I'd been grateful for his guidance, seeing it as evidence of his commitment to our shared future. When we'd moved in together after dating for 8 months, Ryan had volunteered to handle most of our shared expenses. "It's easier if I manage the utilities and rent," he'd explained. "I have more experience dealing with landlords and service providers. Plus, your teaching schedule is so demanding. Let me take care of the boring stuff so you can focus on your students." His consideration had seemed like the perfect partnership. Ryan had been present for every major financial milestone in my life during our 3 years together. He'd helped me fill out my tax returns, been there when I'd applied for my teacher certification renewal, assisted with paperwork when I'd bought my used Honda Civic. Most significantly, he'd been the one to suggest we start building credit together for our eventual home purchase, encouraging me to add him as an authorized user on my existing credit cards while promising to help me apply for new ones with better rewards programs. The home we'd planned to buy together was going to be in Highlands Ranch, a family-friendly suburb south of Denver, where property values were steadily climbing. We'd spent countless weekends at open houses, with Ryan explaining market trends and investment potential, while I'd focused on school districts and commute times. I'd trusted his expertise completely, never questioning his analysis of property values or financing options. Now I realized he'd been using those house hunting expeditions to assess my financial credibility and commitment to major purchases. The engagement had come during a hiking trip to Mount Evans, one of Colorado's famous 14ers. Ryan had proposed at sunrise, with the entire Front Range spread out below us in golden light. The ring was a modest solitaire that fit perfectly within my teacher's budget, and I'd been touched by his thoughtfulness in choosing something beautiful but practical. "I want to build something real with you, Emma," he'd said as I'd cried happy tears at 14,000 feet above sea level. "Something that lasts." The wedding planning process had been where Ryan's financial involvement had reached its peak. He'd volunteered to handle all the vendor negotiations, claiming his real estate experience made him better at contract discussions. He'd managed our joint wedding savings account, depositing his contributions while tracking expenses in a detailed spreadsheet. When I'd suggested we might need to scale back some of our plans due to budget constraints, he'd assured me that his business was picking up and we could afford more than I thought. Looking back now, I could see how deliberately he'd positioned himself as the financial decision-maker in our relationship. Every conversation about money had been framed around his expertise and my naivete. When I'd expressed concerns about debt or suggested being more conservative with spending, he'd reassured me with complex explanations about cash flow and investment strategies that had made me feel foolish for worrying. His confidence had been infectious, making me believe that my teacher's salary and careful budgeting were unnecessarily restrictive. The red flags had been there, but they'd been expertly disguised as green ones. Ryan's expensive tastes, the designer clothes, the high-end electronics, the frequent business dinners at costly restaurants had been explained as necessary professional expenses that would pay dividends in future real estate commissions. His reluctance to combine our finances completely had been framed as protecting my assets until after marriage. His insistence on handling certain bills and financial paperwork had been presented as chivalrous assistance. Most damaging of all had been his subtle undermining of my financial confidence. Whenever I'd suggested budget adjustments or questioned major expenses, Ryan had responded with patronizing explanations about how my teacher's mindset made me too risk-averse for wealth building. "You're thinking like an employee instead of thinking like an investor," he'd say gently. "That's why you need me to help you see the bigger picture." Over time, I'd stopped questioning his financial decisions, deferring to his supposed expertise. The Jessica situation had been woven into our relationship from the beginning, but so subtly that I'd never seen the threat. Ryan had mentioned his ex-girlfriend occasionally, always in the context of their mature, friendly, post-breakup relationship. "Jessica and I realized we were better as friends," he'd explained early in our relationship. "We want different things in life, but there's no hard feelings. I think it's important to maintain positive relationships with people who've been significant in your life." I'd actually admired what I'd thought was his emotional maturity. Unlike some men who spoke bitterly about their exes or refused to acknowledge past relationships, Ryan had seemed evolved and secure. When Jessica's name came up in conversation, it was usually in passing, a mention that he'd run into her at a networking event or that she'd asked for advice about some professional decision. I'd never felt threatened because he'd always been transparent about their contact. The transparency, I now realized, had been carefully curated. Ryan had shared just enough information about Jessica to seem honest, while concealing the true nature of their ongoing relationship. When he'd mentioned helping her with business advice or professional connections, I'd assumed he was being a good friend to someone trying to establish herself in Denver's competitive social media landscape. I'd never imagined that his help involved stealing my identity to fund her lifestyle. There had been times when Ryan's behavior around his phone had seemed slightly off. Quick responses to texts during dinner, calls taken in another room, but he'd always had reasonable explanations. "Real estate never sleeps," he'd joke. "Clients expect immediate responses, even on weekends." His work did require constant communication, so his phone habits had never raised serious suspicions. The Bali trip should have been the smoking gun, but Ryan had covered it expertly. He'd told me he was going to a real estate conference in Phoenix, showing me registration materials and a hotel booking that I now suspected were fabricated. He'd been responsive to my texts and calls during the conference, sending pictures of boring meeting rooms and hotel lobbies that could have been taken anywhere. Meanwhile, he'd been on a romantic vacation with Jessica, documenting their luxury getaway on her Instagram while lying to my face. The financial paperwork that Ryan had helped me organize over the years now took on a sinister new meaning. Every tax return he'd assisted with, every credit report he'd helped me review, every financial document he'd offered to file, all of it had been opportunities to memorize and record my personal information. The man I'd trusted with my financial future had been systematically collecting the data he needed to steal my identity. What hurt most was realizing how carefully he'd studied my personality to execute his fraud. Ryan had understood that my teacher's mindset made me naturally trusting and inclined to believe the best of people. He'd known that my modest background made me insecure about financial matters, making me susceptible to his supposed expertise. He'd recognized that my desire for a stable, committed relationship would make me overlook inconsistencies in favor of preserving what I thought we were building together. The cruelest part was that Ryan's feelings for Jessica had been real, while his feelings for me had been performance. Every "I love you," every discussion about our future, every romantic gesture had been delivered by someone whose heart belonged to another woman. I'd been competing in a game I hadn't known existed, trying to build a genuine relationship with someone who was already committed elsewhere. As I sat in our apartment that first night after confronting him, surrounded by the detritus of 3 years of shared life, I began to understand the true scope of what had been stolen from me. It wasn't just the $95,000 in fraudulent debt, though that amount would take years to resolve and had already damaged my credit score. It wasn't just the time and emotional energy I'd invested in a relationship that had been built on lies from the beginning. What Ryan had stolen was my faith in my own judgment. Every decision I'd made about love, about trust, about building a future had been based on false information. I'd prided myself on being a good judge of character, on having the emotional intelligence that made me an effective teacher. Now I questioned everything I'd believed about my ability to read people, to assess situations, to protect myself from harm. The financial implications were staggering but manageable compared to the psychological damage. I was 28 years old, starting over from scratch with damaged credit and a broken heart. The home we'd planned to buy was impossible now with my ruined financial profile. The wedding we'd been planning was canceled, along with all the deposits we'd made. The future I'd been building had been demolished in a single afternoon. But as devastating as these realizations were, they also brought a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in 3 years, I was seeing my situation without Ryan's filter, without his explanations and reassurances coloring my perception. The truth was brutal, but it was mine. And with that truth came the first stirrings of something I'd never felt before. Not just anger at being wronged, but cold determination to make sure there were consequences. The next morning brought fresh horrors as I continued my investigation into the extent of the fraud. I'd requested detailed statements from all 3 credit card companies, and what I discovered made my stomach turn. The purchases weren't just expensive, they were personal, intimate, chosen with care and attention that Ryan had never shown when buying things for me. The Tiffany purchase that had appeared on my Chase statement wasn't just any jewelry, it was a custom-designed necklace with Jessica's initials in rose gold. The Nordstrom charges weren't random shopping sprees, but carefully curated outfits in Jessica's exact size, brands that I recognized from her Instagram posts. The Bali trip wasn't just a vacation, but a recreation of a romantic getaway that Jessica had been posting about wanting to take for months. Ryan hadn't just been funding Jessica's lifestyle, he'd been courting her with a level of thoughtfulness and attention that he'd never shown me. Every purchase was evidence of how well he knew her preferences, her style, her dreams. He'd been the devoted boyfriend to her while playing the committed fiancé to me, and he'd been better at loving her than he'd ever been at pretending to love me. The discovery that cut deepest was a charge from a high-end photography studio in Reno, the trendy arts district where Jessica lived. When I called pretending to be confirming an appointment, the photographer mentioned the beautiful engagement photos they'd taken for a young couple a few months ago. The session had been paid for with my Chase Sapphire card, meaning Ryan had used my stolen identity to document his proposal to another woman. As I hung up the phone, I realized I was no longer dealing with simple financial fraud. This was psychological warfare conducted by someone who understood exactly how to inflict maximum emotional damage. Ryan hadn't just stolen my money, he'd used it to build the relationship I'd thought I was having with him. Every romantic gesture Jessica had received, every symbol of love and commitment, had been purchased with credit cards opened in my name. The engagement photos that should have been ours existed, but they were his with someone else, paid for with my stolen identity. The romantic getaway that we'd planned for our honeymoon had already happened. But with Jessica in Bali, while I'd been home alone believing he was at a work conference. The thoughtful gifts that demonstrated deep knowledge of a partner's preferences had been purchased, but for the woman he actually loved, using credit that belonged to me. I spent the morning creating a timeline that mapped Ryan's fraud against the major milestones in our relationship. The pattern was clear and devastating. Every step forward in our supposed commitment had coincided with an escalation in his financial crimes. When we'd gotten engaged, he'd opened the American Express card to fund Jessica's wardrobe upgrade. When we'd started seriously house hunting, he'd opened the Capital One card to pay for their romantic photography session. When we'd begun wedding planning, he'd maxed out the Chase card to take her on the vacation I'd thought would be our honeymoon. The psychological sophistication of his manipulation became clear as I studied the evidence. Ryan had used my own hopes and dreams as weapons against me, timing his romantic gestures to coincide with major fraudulent purchases. Every time I'd felt secure in our relationship, every moment when I'd believed we were building something real together, he'd been stealing from me to fund his actual romantic life. But the evidence also revealed something that Ryan and Jessica hadn't anticipated: their own carelessness. In their confidence that I would never discover the truth, they'd left digital footprints everywhere. Jessica's Instagram posts were time-stamped and geotagged, creating an exact record of when and where my stolen money had been spent. Ryan's credit card applications had been submitted from IP addresses that I could trace back to his office computer. Their romantic photos had been posted online with metadata that included location information and photographer credits. As I compiled this evidence, I felt something shifting inside me. The heartbroken teacher who'd discovered her fiancé's betrayal was evolving into someone more dangerous. Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by fighting back. They'd made a crucial error in underestimating my intelligence and my capacity for strategic thinking. They'd seen only what they wanted to see, a trusting woman with good credit and a stable income. What they'd failed to recognize was that elementary school teachers are natural investigators. We spend our days analyzing behavior, identifying patterns, and uncovering the truth behind children's stories. We're trained to spot inconsistencies, to ask the right questions, and to persist until we understand what's really happening. The skills that made me effective in the classroom would serve me well in bringing down the people who'd tried to destroy my life. The realization that I possessed the tools to fight back brought the first moment of genuine hope I'd felt since discovering the fraud. Ryan and Jessica had stolen my money, my trust, and my future, but they'd also awakened something in me that they couldn't control or predict. They'd created an enemy with intimate knowledge of their crimes, unlimited motivation for justice, and increasingly little concern for the conventional rules that had made me an easy target. As I sat in my apartment that evening, surrounded by evidence and planning my next moves, I caught sight of my reflection in the darkened window. The face looking back at me was still recognizably mine, but there was something different about the eyes. The naive trust was gone, replaced by a calculating intelligence that I'd never recognized in myself before. Emma Collins, the elementary school teacher who believed in fairness and second chances, was disappearing. In her place was someone who understood that in a world where people could steal your identity and your future without remorse, justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you created yourself. The transformation was just beginning, and I found myself curious about who I would become by the time this was over. One thing was certain. Ryan and Jessica had no idea what they'd unleashed when they'd decided to make me their victim. They were about to discover that some people, when pushed beyond their breaking point, don't break. They become something far more dangerous than they ever imagined possible. The following week passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and surreal discovery. I returned to work at Pine Valley Elementary, teaching my second graders about addition and subtraction, while my own life had become an exercise in calculating devastating losses. On the surface, I maintained my professional composure, but beneath that facade, I was conducting the most important investigation of my life. My students noticed that something was different. Children have an uncanny ability to sense when adults are distracted or upset, and several of my more perceptive students asked if I was feeling okay. "You seem sad, Miss Collins," said Sophia, one of my brightest students during reading time. "Did something bad happen?" I managed to smile and reassure her that everything was fine, but her concern reminded me how much I'd lost. My natural warmth and enthusiasm for teaching had been casualties of Ryan's betrayal. After school each day, I transformed into a different person entirely. I'd drive home to my apartment and immediately dive into the evidence I was systematically gathering. I'd created a comprehensive filing system, organizing credit card statements, social media screenshots, and transaction records, with the same meticulous attention to detail that I brought to lesson planning. Each new piece of information revealed another layer of the deception I'd been living with for 18 months. The most disturbing discovery came when I started cross-referencing Ryan's business trips with Jessica's social media posts. What I found was a pattern of coordinated lies that spanned our entire relationship. Every time Ryan had claimed to be traveling for work, Jessica had coincidentally been posting from the same locations. Their romantic getaways had been happening throughout our engagement, funded by credit cards that carried my name and destroyed my financial future. The Chicago trip that Ryan claimed was for a real estate conference had actually been a romantic weekend, where Jessica posted photos of them at the Art Institute and Navy Pier. The Las Vegas trip that he'd said was for client meetings had been a couple's vacation documented extensively on Jessica's Instagram, complete with photos of expensive dinners and shows that appeared as charges on my fraudulent American Express account. The pattern was clear. My stolen identity had been funding their entire romantic relationship while I'd been home alone, planning our wedding. What made the betrayal even more painful was seeing how happy they looked together in Jessica's photos. These weren't the stilted, performative images of two people pretending to be in love. They were genuine moments of joy and connection that Ryan had never shared with me. In every photo, he looked relaxed and genuinely content in a way that I now realized he'd never been during our 3 years together. I'd been competing against a ghost, trying to build something real with someone whose heart had always belonged elsewhere. The financial investigation revealed that Ryan's manipulation had been even more sophisticated than I'd initially understood. He hadn't just opened credit cards in my name. He'd been systematically inflating my reported income on the applications to qualify for higher credit limits. By claiming I earned nearly twice my actual teacher's salary, he'd been able to secure premium cards with substantial spending power. The fabricated income information meant that the credit card companies would be even more aggressive in pursuing repayment, as they'd extended credit based on false financial profiles. Ryan had also been using my personal information to open other types of accounts that I was only beginning to discover. There was a high-yield savings account in my name that had been used to park cash between credit card transactions. There was a PayPal account linked to my identity that had been used for online purchases. Most disturbing of all, there was evidence that he'd attempted to use my information to apply for a personal loan, though fortunately that application had been denied due to increasing inquiries on my credit report. The scope of the identity theft was staggering, but what really drove home the premeditated nature of his crimes was finding evidence that he'd been researching credit card fraud techniques online. In my determination to understand how he'd executed his scheme, I'd convinced a tech-savvy colleague to help me access the browsing history on our shared laptop. What we found was a comprehensive education in financial fraud, articles about synthetic identity theft, forums discussing credit card application strategies, and even YouTube videos explaining how to avoid detection when using someone else's personal information. Ryan hadn't stumbled into this crime. He'd studied it, planned it, and executed it with careful attention to detail. He'd spent months learning how to steal my identity effectively, researching the best credit cards to target and the most efficient ways to maximize spending without triggering immediate fraud alerts. The man I'd thought was spontaneously generous and romantic had actually been following a carefully researched playbook for financial crime. The evidence also revealed that Jessica had been far from an innocent beneficiary of Ryan's crimes. Her social media posts included captions that showed clear awareness of the deception. Photos of expensive purchases were accompanied by comments like, "Grateful for the creative financing that makes dreams possible," and quote, "Sometimes the best gifts come from unexpected sources." She'd even posted a cryptic message about the things we do for love on the same day that Ryan had maxed out my Chase card for their Bali vacation. Jessica's Instagram account became a treasure trove of evidence as I studied it more carefully. She'd been documenting not just the purchases made with my stolen identity, but also her knowledge of the fraud itself. In one particularly damning post, she'd shared a photo of expensive jewelry with the caption, quote, "When your man finds creative ways to spoil you," followed by a winking emoji. The timestamp on that post corresponded exactly to the date of a major fraudulent charge on my American Express card. The realization that both Ryan and Jessica had been laughing at my expense while destroying my financial future brought a new level of anger that I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just theft. It was a deliberate, coordinated effort to humiliate and destroy someone they saw as expendable. They'd turned my trust and love into weapons against me, using my own financial identity to fund their romance, while planning to discard me once I was no longer useful. As I gathered this evidence, I also began researching my legal options and the likely outcomes of reporting the fraud. What I learned was both encouraging and infuriating. The evidence I'd compiled was comprehensive enough to support serious criminal charges against both Ryan and Jessica. Identity theft, credit card fraud, and conspiracy charges could result in significant prison sentences and financial penalties. However, the legal process would be long, complex, and uncertain. Criminal cases could take years to resolve, and even successful prosecutions might not result in full financial recovery. Civil remedies might eventually compensate me for some of my losses, but the damage to my credit and financial future would persist for years regardless of legal outcomes. The system seemed designed to provide minimal protection for victims, while offering numerous advantages to sophisticated criminals. More frustrating was learning that Ryan's threats about my potential complicity weren't entirely baseless. While I had strong evidence of my innocence, proving that I'd been unaware of the fraud would require extensive documentation and testimony. The fact that we'd lived together and shared financial responsibilities would complicate my case, potentially making me appear negligent even if I wasn't legally culpable. The credit card company's initial responses to my fraud reports were mixed. While they were required to investigate my claims, the representatives I spoke with seemed skeptical about my insistence that I'd been completely unaware of cards opened in my name. The sophisticated nature of the fraud, combined with Ryan's intimate knowledge of my personal information, made my case less straightforward than typical identity theft situations. One particularly frustrating conversation with a Chase fraud investigator highlighted the challenges I was facing. "Mrs. Collins," the investigator had said, "I need to understand how someone could open an account in your name, have statements sent to a different address, and make purchases for 18 months without your knowledge. Can you walk me through your household financial management practices?" The implication was clear. Either I was lying about my involvement, or I was negligently oblivious to my own financial situation. These conversations forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about how completely I'd abdicated financial responsibility to Ryan during our relationship. My trust in him had been so complete that I'd stopped monitoring my own credit reports, reviewing financial statements, or maintaining awareness of my overall financial picture. In trying to be a supportive partner, I'd made myself an ideal victim for the crime he'd been planning. The psychological impact of this realization was almost as devastating as the original betrayal. I'd prided myself on being a responsible adult, someone who took care of herself and made good decisions. Discovering that I'd been so thoroughly manipulated forced me to question everything I believed about my own competence and judgment. How could someone who taught children about making good choices have been so blind to the manipulation happening in her own life? As the week progressed and I continued gathering evidence, I found myself changing in ways that both excited and frightened me. The trusting, optimistic teacher who'd believed in fairness and second chances was disappearing, replaced by someone harder and more calculating. I caught myself analyzing every interaction for hidden motives, questioning every story for inconsistencies, approaching every situation with suspicion instead of trust. The transformation was most evident in how I handled the practical aspects of my investigation. I'd never considered myself particularly deceptive, but I found myself becoming skilled at extracting information through careful questioning and strategic misdirection. When I called businesses to verify transactions, I created plausible cover stories that got me the information I needed without revealing my true purpose. When I researched Ryan and Jessica's activities, I used techniques that bordered on stalking but provided crucial evidence for my case. By Friday of that week, I'd compiled enough evidence to support serious criminal charges and had a clear understanding of the legal landscape I was facing. But I'd also reached a different conclusion about how to proceed. The traditional path of reporting the crime and hoping for justice suddenly seemed insufficient for the scope of what had been done to me. Ryan and Jessica had spent 18 months systematically destroying my financial future while mocking my trust and planning my eventual disposal. They'd turned my own identity into a weapon against me, stealing not just money but years of my life and my faith in my own judgment. The legal system might eventually hold them accountable, but it would never give me back what they'd taken or ensure that they truly understood the consequences of their actions. As I sat in my apartment that Friday evening, surrounded by evidence and legal research, I realized that I was facing a choice that would define who I became. I could be Emma Collins, the victim who reported the crime and hoped for justice from a system that seemed indifferent to her suffering. Or I could become someone else entirely. Someone who understood that real justice sometimes required taking matters into your own hands. The decision I made that night would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just my own life, but the lives of everyone who'd underestimated the quiet teacher from Capitol Hill. Ryan and Jessica had awakened something in me that they couldn't control or predict, and they were about to discover that some victims don't stay victims. They evolve into something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change the trajectory of my investigation entirely. I was grading spelling tests during my lunch break when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was hesitant but determined, belonging to a woman who introduced herself as Lisa Parker. "I think we need to talk," she said without preamble. "I'm Ryan's sister, and I know what he's been doing to you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd met Lisa exactly twice during my 3 years with Ryan, brief encounters at family gatherings where she'd seemed distant and uncomfortable. I'd assumed she simply didn't like me, another member of the Mitchell family who found me unworthy of their golden boy. Lisa suggested we meet at a coffee shop in Cherry Creek, far from both our usual haunts. As I drove there after school, my mind raced with possibilities. Was this a trap orchestrated by Ryan to gather information about my plans? Or was Lisa genuinely reaching out because she knew something that could help my case? The paranoia that had been growing since discovering the fraud made it impossible to take anything at face value. The woman waiting for me at a corner table looked exhausted, her designer clothes unable to hide the stress lines around her eyes. Lisa had always resembled Ryan with her sharp cheekbones and confident bearing, but today she seemed diminished, almost fragile. She stood when she saw me, her smile tentative and apologetic. "Emma, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see anyone from the family after what Ryan did." Her acknowledgement of his crimes was immediate and unequivocal, which caught me off guard. I'd expected denial or attempts to minimize his actions. "How much do you know?" I asked, settling into my chair and studying her face for signs of deception. The investigation had taught me to look for micro-expressions, inconsistencies in body language, tells that might reveal hidden agendas. Lisa's laugh was bitter and tired. "I know that my brother has been stealing your identity for over a year to fund his obsession with Jessica Torres. I know that he's been lying to you about business trips while he's actually been traveling with her. And I know that he's been planning to marry you under false pretenses to gain access to even more of your financial resources." The comprehensive nature of her knowledge was staggering. This wasn't casual family gossip or overheard fragments of conversation. Lisa had detailed information about Ryan's crimes, which meant either she'd been investigating him herself, or she'd been closer to the situation than I'd realized. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral despite the emotions churning inside me. If Lisa had known about the fraud and done nothing to warn me, she was complicit in her own way. "I started suspecting something 6 months ago," Lisa admitted, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup like she was seeking warmth. Ryan's lifestyle suddenly improved dramatically, but his real estate sales hadn't increased proportionally. He was wearing expensive clothes, driving a new car, taking elaborate vacations, all while claiming business was slow. Lisa explained that she'd initially assumed Ryan was having unusual success in real estate that he was downplaying for tax purposes or family dynamics. The Mitchell family had always been competitive about financial achievements, and she thought he might be hiding his prosperity to avoid their parents' expectations or her own jealousy. "But then I saw him with Jessica at Cherry Creek Mall, and everything clicked," Lisa continued, her voice growing harder. "They were shopping together, using a credit card that definitely wasn't his usual one. The way they were behaving, it wasn't like friends or even friends with benefits. They were acting like a committed couple, completely comfortable and intimate." That shopping trip had occurred during one of Ryan's supposed client meetings, when he'd told me he was showing properties to a demanding buyer from California. Lisa had watched them spend thousands of dollars on jewelry and clothes, money that she now realized was coming from credit cards opened fraudulently in my name. "I confronted him that evening," Lisa said, her eyes filling with tears. "I asked him directly if he was cheating on you and where he was getting the money for his upgraded lifestyle. He broke down and told me everything: the credit cards, the identity theft, the plan to marry you for financial access. He even showed me some of the documentation. The revelation that Ryan had confessed his crimes to his sister months ago, while continuing to lie to my face, added another layer of betrayal. Lisa had known I was being systematically defrauded and had chosen to remain silent, making her a passive accomplice to my destruction. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. "You watched me plan a wedding with a man who was stealing my identity. You sat through family dinners knowing I was being scammed. How could you stay quiet?" Lisa's composure finally cracked, and she began crying openly. "Because I'm a coward," she said through her tears. "Because Ryan convinced me that you'd never find out, that he'd pay everything back before it affected you. Because I was terrified of destroying our family if the truth came out. Because I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to fix my brother's mistakes." Her honesty was brutal but somehow refreshing after months of living with lies and manipulation. At least Lisa was acknowledging her complicity, instead of making excuses or shifting blame. But her guilt didn't change the fact that she'd chosen family loyalty over basic human decency. "What changed your mind?" I asked. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because last week Ryan told me he was accelerating his timeline," Lisa replied, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "He said the credit cards were nearly maxed out, and he needed to marry you quickly to gain access to joint accounts and apply for new credit together. He was planning to propose moving up the wedding date, claiming it was romantic spontaneity when it was actually criminal urgency." The information sent chills down my spine. Ryan's plan had been even more sinister than I'd realized. He wasn't just stealing my current identity. He was planning to trap me in a legal marriage that would give him permanent access to my financial future. Once we were married, his ability to commit fraud in my name would expand dramatically, and my ability to separate myself from his crimes would become virtually impossible. "There's more," Lisa continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Ryan has been researching bankruptcy strategies. He knows that eventually the credit card debt will become unmanageable, and he's been planning to file for bankruptcy in your name to eliminate the fraudulent debt while protecting his own assets." The bankruptcy plan revealed the full scope of Ryan's criminal sophistication. He'd been planning not just to steal my identity, but to systematically destroy my financial future in a way that would take decades to recover from. Bankruptcy would have eliminated the credit card debt, but devastated my credit score, my ability to secure housing or employment, my entire economic future. "He showed me the paperwork he'd been preparing," Lisa said, pulling a manila envelope from her purse. "I made copies of everything I could find in his home office. Bank statements, credit applications, even his research into bankruptcy law. I thought you should have evidence that shows how premeditated this all was." The envelope contained dozens of documents that painted a picture of criminal planning that spanned years rather than months. Ryan had been researching identity theft techniques long before we'd met, suggesting that targeting me hadn't been a spontaneous decision, but a calculated choice based on my profile as an ideal victim. There were printed articles about teacher salaries and credit profiles, highlighting how educators often had stable income and excellent credit scores while lacking sophisticated financial knowledge. There were notes about my family background, my social connections, my personality traits, all analyzed for their potential usefulness in executing long-term fraud. Most chilling was a handwritten timeline that mapped major relationship milestones against planned financial crimes. Moving in together coincided with Phase 1, information gathering. Our engagement aligned with Phase 2, credit access. Our planned wedding was marked as Phase 3, legal asset control, followed by Phase 4, bankruptcy and exit strategy. The documents made it clear that our entire relationship had been a criminal enterprise disguised as romance. Every milestone I'd celebrated as evidence of our growing commitment had actually been Ryan progressing through stages of a carefully planned financial crime. The man I'd loved had never existed. He'd been a character created specifically to facilitate my victimization. "There's something else you need to know," Lisa said, her voice barely audible. "Ryan isn't working alone. Jessica has been an active participant in planning the fraud, not just a passive beneficiary. She's been researching ways to monetize stolen identities, looking into additional schemes they could run once they perfected their technique with you." The revelation that Jessica was an equal partner in the conspiracy rather than just a beneficiary changed everything about how I understood their relationship. This wasn't a case of Ryan stealing to impress a woman who was unaware of his methods. Jessica had been actively collaborating in my destruction, helping to plan and execute crimes that would fund their life together. They've been planning to target other women, Lisa continued, sliding another set of documents across the table. Jessica has been identifying potential victims through social media, single professional women with good credit and stable incomes. They were going to use the techniques they perfected with you to run similar scams on multiple targets. The papers Lisa had brought showed a sophisticated criminal operation that extended far beyond my personal victimization. There were profiles of other women in Denver, detailed analyses of their financial situations, even preliminary identity theft attempts that had been abandoned for tactical reasons. Ryan and Jessica weren't just criminals. They were predators who'd been planning to make careers out of destroying women's lives. As I studied the evidence Lisa had provided, I realized that I wasn't just seeking justice for myself anymore. There were other potential victims who needed protection, other women who might fall into the same trap that had ensnared me. The scope of Ryan and Jessica's criminal ambitions made my personal quest for revenge feel almost small by comparison. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked Lisa. "What do you want from me?" "I want to help you stop them," she replied, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "I know I should have come forward sooner, but I'm here now. I have access to information you could never get on your own. I know their plans, their resources, their weaknesses. If you're planning to fight back, I want to be part of it." The offer of alliance from within the Mitchell family was unexpected, but potentially invaluable. Lisa's access to Ryan's personal information, combined with her insider knowledge of family dynamics and resources, could provide advantages that I couldn't achieve alone. But trusting her meant relying on someone who'd already proven capable of betraying someone she claimed to care about. "What's in it for you?" I asked bluntly. "Why risk your relationship with your family to help me?" Lisa's answer surprised me with its honesty and self-awareness. "Because I'm tired of being complicit in something evil," she said simply. "Because watching Ryan destroy you has made me realize how much I've enabled his behavior over the years. Because if I don't help stop him now, I'll be partially responsible for whatever he does to his next victims." Her moral awakening seemed genuine, but I'd learned not to trust appearances or emotional appeals. "If we do this together, I need complete honesty from you," I said. "No more family loyalty, no more protecting Ryan, no more withholding information because it's uncomfortable. If you hold anything back, you're working against me." "I understand," Lisa nodded. "And Emma, there's one more thing you should know. Ryan has been monitoring your communications. He installed tracking software on your phone and laptop months ago, supposedly to help you if they were ever stolen. He knows about your fraud reports, your evidence gathering, everything you've been doing since you discovered the truth." The information hit me like a physical blow. Every conversation with credit card companies, every online search, every document I'd created, Ryan had been watching it all unfold in real time. He knew exactly what evidence I'd gathered, which witnesses I'd contacted, what strategies I was considering. My investigation hadn't been secret at all. "How long has he been spying on me?" I asked, my mind racing through the implications of this surveillance. "Since you moved in together," Lisa replied apologetically. "He told me it was a security measure, that he wanted to protect you from identity theft." The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. The revelation that Ryan had been monitoring my communications for years, while simultaneously stealing my identity, was perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of his crimes. He'd been watching me live my life, reading my private messages, observing my emotional responses to his manipulation, all while planning my systematic destruction. "He knows I'm here talking to you," I realized aloud. "He's probably watching this conversation happen in real time." Lisa shook her head. "I left my phone at home and disabled the GPS in my car. I've learned a few things about avoiding his surveillance over the past few months. But you're right that we need to assume he's monitoring everything else." The need for operational security added another layer of complexity to any plan for fighting back. Traditional law enforcement reporting would be compromised before I could even file charges. Legal consultations would be monitored, giving Ryan advance warning of any formal action I planned to take. Even communication with potential allies would be intercepted and analyzed. "This changes everything," I said, my mind already working through new strategies that accounted for Ryan's surveillance capabilities. If he's been watching my investigation, then he knows exactly how much evidence I have and how close I am to exposing him. Which means he's probably planning his own preemptive strike, Lisa agreed grimly. Ryan doesn't wait for problems to escalate. He eliminates them before they become threats. If he thinks you're getting too close to causing serious trouble for him, he'll take action to discredit or neutralize you. The conversation with Lisa had revealed that I was facing adversaries who were more sophisticated, more dangerous, and more prepared than I'd realized. But it had also provided me with intelligence about their operations, access to their planning documents, and a potential ally with insider knowledge. Most importantly, it had confirmed that my instincts about fighting back were correct. The traditional legal system would be inadequate for addressing the scope of their crimes. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Lisa handed me one final document that would prove crucial to everything that followed. "This is Ryan's contingency plan," she said quietly. "What he intends to do if you get too close to exposing him. You need to read this carefully, because it shows you exactly what kind of person you're really dealing with." The document was handwritten in Ryan's familiar script, outlining a strategy for discrediting me if I became a threat to his operations. The plan involved planting evidence that I'd been complicit in the fraud, creating fake communications that showed my knowledge and consent, even spreading rumors about my mental stability and professional competence. Ryan had been prepared to destroy not just my financial future, but my reputation, my career, and my sanity if necessary to protect himself. The contingency plan revealed someone who viewed me not as a human being, but as an obstacle to be eliminated by any means necessary. It was the final piece of evidence I needed to understand that I wasn't dealing with someone who could be reasoned with or appealed to. I was dealing with a predator who would destroy me completely if given the opportunity. As I drove home from my meeting with Lisa, I realized that the naive teacher who'd discovered her fiancé's betrayal was truly dead. In her place was someone who understood that justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you created through careful planning, strategic thinking, and the willingness to use every available weapon against those who threatened you. The intelligence Lisa had provided would be invaluable, but it also meant accepting that I was now committed to a path that would require me to become someone I'd never imagined being. Emma Collins, the trusting elementary school teacher, could never have fought back effectively against Ryan and Jessica's sophisticated criminal operation. But the person I was becoming, someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous, might just be capable of bringing them down. The next phase of my transformation began with a trip to a small electronics store in an area of Denver I'd never visited before. Using cash and providing false contact information, I purchased a new phone, laptop, and several pieces of equipment that would help me communicate securely and gather intelligence without Ryan's knowledge. The clerk who helped me seemed to recognize that I was someone trying to disappear from unwanted surveillance, asking no questions, and providing advice about maintaining digital privacy. Back at my apartment, I began the methodical process of creating a new identity for my investigation. Not the kind of identity theft that Ryan had committed against me, but a carefully constructed persona that would allow me to operate without detection. I opened new email accounts using public Wi-Fi networks, created social media profiles with fictional backgrounds, and established secure communication channels that couldn't be monitored or traced. The process of becoming someone else was both liberating and terrifying. Every step away from my established identity as Emma Collins felt like shedding skin, leaving behind not just my old life but fundamental aspects of who I'd always believed myself to be. The trusting nature that had made me an effective teacher was being replaced by suspicious calculation. The optimistic faith in human goodness was being replaced by cynical assessment of everyone's potential motives. But along with these losses came new capabilities that I'd never possessed before. I found myself naturally talented at deception and misdirection, able to create plausible cover stories and extract information from unsuspecting sources. The analytical skills that had served me well in the classroom translated perfectly to criminal investigation, allowing me to identify patterns and inconsistencies that revealed hidden truths. Within a week of my meeting with Lisa, I'd established a secure operational infrastructure that allowed me to investigate Ryan and Jessica without their knowledge. I'd also begun reaching out to the other potential victims that Lisa's documents had identified, carefully approaching them with warnings about the danger they faced. The first woman I contacted was Sarah Martinez, a nurse practitioner whose profile had been extensively researched by Ryan and Jessica. When I called her using a cover story about identity theft prevention, I discovered that she'd already been receiving suspicious credit inquiries and pre-approved card offers that she hadn't applied for. My warning came just in time to prevent her from becoming their next victim. The conversation with Sarah revealed that Ryan and Jessica's operation was more advanced than even Lisa had known. They'd been actively pursuing multiple targets simultaneously, laying groundwork for crimes that would have destroyed several women's lives. The scope of their planned criminality made my personal quest for justice feel like part of a larger mission to protect an entire community of potential victims. As I continued my investigation using my new secure methods, I began to uncover evidence that Ryan and Jessica's crimes extended beyond identity theft into other areas of fraud and manipulation. There were indications that Ryan had been misrepresenting properties to real estate clients, inflating appraisals, and hiding structural problems to maximize his commissions. Jessica had been running fake charity campaigns on social media, collecting donations for fictional causes, and pocketing the money. The pattern that emerged was of two people who viewed other human beings as resources to be exploited, rather than individuals deserving of respect and honesty. Every relationship they'd formed, every professional interaction they'd engaged in, had been evaluated for its potential criminal utility. They weren't just criminals. They were parasites who fed on other people's trust and goodwill. This realization brought a new level of moral clarity to my mission. I wasn't just seeking personal revenge against people who'd wronged me. I was working to protect society from predators who would continue destroying lives until they were stopped. The transformation from victim to protector gave my actions a sense of purpose that went beyond personal satisfaction. The evidence I was gathering through my investigation would eventually support criminal charges that could put both Ryan and Jessica in prison for years. But as I learned more about the scope of their crimes and the sophistication of their operations, I began to understand that legal justice alone might not be sufficient to truly neutralize the threat they represented. Criminal prosecutions could take years to complete, during which time they might flee, destroy evidence, or continue victimizing other people. Even successful convictions might result in relatively light sentences that wouldn't adequately reflect the psychological and financial damage they'd inflicted. The legal system, designed to protect the rights of the accused, often provided inadequate protection for victims of sophisticated financial crimes. The realization that I might need to pursue justice outside the traditional legal framework was both empowering and frightening. It meant accepting that I was capable of actions that the old Emma Collins would have found morally unthinkable. But it also meant recognizing that sometimes the protection of innocent people required methods that weren't sanctioned by conventional authorities. As I sat in my apartment 3 weeks after discovering Ryan's betrayal, surrounded by evidence of crimes that spanned years and affected multiple victims, I understood that I'd reached a point of no return. The woman who'd woken up that morning in April thinking she was planning a wedding to someone who loved her was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that justice wasn't always delivered by courts and law enforcement. Sometimes it had to be created by people willing to do whatever was necessary to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The metamorphosis was complete, and Emma Collins was ready to begin the real work of bringing down the criminal enterprise that had tried to destroy her life. What Ryan and Jessica didn't understand was that in trying to make her their victim, they'd actually created their most dangerous adversary, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by ensuring they faced consequences for their crimes. The planning phase was over. It was time to begin the systematic destruction of everything Ryan and Jessica had built on the foundation of other people's suffering. And unlike their crimes, which had been motivated by greed and selfishness, my mission would be driven by something far more powerful: the absolute determination to ensure that justice was served, regardless of what it cost me personally to deliver it. The opportunity to put my new skills to the test came sooner than expected. Maya Chen, my college friend who'd become a private investigator, had been quietly helping me gather intelligence about Ryan and Jessica's activities. When she called me on a secure line with urgent news, I knew the game was about to change dramatically. "Emma, you need to hear this," Maya said, her voice tight with excitement and concern. "I've been monitoring Ryan's communications through some contacts in law enforcement, and he's planning something big. There's going to be a meeting tomorrow night at Jessica's apartment in Reno. Not just the two of them, other people are involved. The information sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. For weeks, I'd been gathering evidence and building cases, but this was the first opportunity to observe their operation in real time. What kind of meeting? I asked, already planning how to position myself for surveillance. From what I can piece together, it's a strategy session about expanding their identity theft ring, Maya explained. There are at least 3 other couples involved, all using similar techniques to target professional women across the Denver metro area. Ryan and Jessica aren't just criminals, they're running a criminal enterprise. The revelation that their operation had grown beyond what even Lisa had known was both shocking and validating. My instincts about the scope of their criminality had been correct, but the reality was even worse than I'd imagined. They weren't just isolated predators, they were the leaders of a network that was systematically destroying women's lives for profit. I need to be there, I said immediately. I need to see who's involved and hear their plans directly. Maya's response was predictably cautious. Emma, this isn't a game anymore. If these people are running a criminal enterprise and they catch you spying on them, you could be in serious physical danger. Maybe we should just pass this information to law enforcement and let them handle surveillance. But I'd moved beyond trusting traditional law enforcement to handle this situation adequately. The evidence I'd already compiled should have been sufficient for arrests. Yet Ryan and Jessica were still operating freely, still planning to victimize more women. The system I'd once believed in was proving inadequate for the scope of the problem I was facing. Law enforcement moves too slowly, I replied, my voice carrying a certainty that surprised even me. By the time they get warrants and organize surveillance, these people could disappear or destroy evidence. I'm going to be there tomorrow night, and I'm going to document everything they say and do. The plan I developed for infiltrating their meeting was elegant in its simplicity. Jessica's apartment building in Reno was a converted warehouse with large windows and an industrial design that prioritized aesthetics over privacy. The building across the street housed several art studios and creative spaces that stayed open late, providing perfect cover for extended surveillance. I spent the day preparing equipment and cover stories, transforming myself once again into someone capable of actions that the old Emma Collins would never have contemplated. The clothing I chose was dark and nondescript, suitable for moving unseen in urban environments. The recording equipment I carried was professional grade, but small enough to conceal easily. Most importantly, the mindset I adopted was that of someone who understood that sometimes justice required breaking rules that protected criminals more than victims. The art studio I rented for the evening was on the 3rd floor, directly across from Jessica's apartment. The owner, a sculptor named Derek who worked late into the night, was happy to rent me space for what I claimed was a photography project, documenting urban nightlife. The cash payment, and my story about capturing the authentic energy of Denver's arts district, seemed to satisfy his curiosity about my unusual timing. As I set up my surveillance equipment, I realized how much I'd changed over the past month. The meticulous planning, the comfortable deception, the calm focus in a potentially dangerous situation, none of these were traits that the elementary school teacher from Capitol Hill had possessed. I'd evolved into someone capable of sophisticated intelligence gathering, and the transformation felt both natural and slightly terrifying. The first participants began arriving at Jessica's apartment around 8 p.m. I recognized Ryan immediately, but the other faces were new to me. There was an older couple who appeared to be in their 40s, impeccably dressed and carrying themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to wealth and power. Behind them came a younger pair, who looked like they could be graduate students or young professionals, their casual appearance contrasting sharply with the obvious expense of their clothing and accessories. Through my telephoto lens, I could see into Jessica's living room clearly. The apartment itself was a testament to the success of their criminal enterprise: designer furniture, expensive artwork, technology that cost more than most people's cars. Everything in that space had been purchased with money stolen from victims like me, a shrine to the prosperity that fraud could provide. As more people arrived, the scope of the operation became clearer. This wasn't just Ryan and Jessica working with a few accomplices. This was a sophisticated network with multiple teams, each specializing in different aspects of identity theft and financial fraud. The meeting had the organization and professionalism of a legitimate business conference, which made their crimes even more chilling. Ryan appeared to be leading the meeting, standing at the front of the room with a laptop and presentation materials. Even from across the street, I could see his confidence and authority as he addressed the group. This was the same man who'd claimed to be struggling with real estate sales, while secretly running a criminal empire worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The recording equipment I'd positioned picked up fragments of conversation through the apartment's large windows. What I heard confirmed my worst fears about the scope of their operation and their plans for expansion. They weren't just discussing past successes. They were planning a coordinated campaign that would target dozens of women across Colorado and neighboring states. The teacher demographic has been incredibly profitable, I heard Ryan saying, his voice carrying clearly across the street. Stable income, excellent credit, naturally trusting personality profiles. We should expand our focus to include nurses, social workers, other helping professions, where people are less likely to be suspicious of romantic approaches. The clinical way he discussed targeting women, based on their professions and personality traits, was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what I witnessed. These weren't crimes of opportunity or desperation. They were carefully planned attacks on women whose only crime was being kind and trusting. Ryan was literally teaching other criminals how to identify and exploit victims like me. Jessica's role in the presentation revealed her as an equal partner in planning and strategy, not just a beneficiary of Ryan's crimes. She discussed social media techniques for identifying potential targets, methods for building fake romantic relationships, and strategies for maintaining long-term fraud without detection. Her expertise was comprehensive and sophisticated, showing that she'd been developing these skills for years. The key is patience, Jessica explained to the group. You can't rush the relationship-building phase. These women need to feel completely secure and loved before they'll give you access to their financial information. The emotional investment has to feel real, even though it's completely fabricated. Listening to her describe the systematic emotional manipulation that I'd experienced was like hearing someone dissect my own psychological autopsy. Every romantic gesture, every declaration of love, every moment of apparent intimacy had been calculated to make me more vulnerable to financial exploitation. The relationship I'd treasured as the foundation of my future had been nothing more than a criminal technique executed with professional precision. The older couple, who I learned were named Patricia and William Hoffman, were apparently the senior partners in this enterprise. They discussed the financial infrastructure they'd built to launder money and hide assets, revealing a level of sophistication that suggested decades of criminal experience. Their calm professionalism, while discussing the destruction of innocent people's lives, was chilling to witness. We've established shell companies in Nevada and Delaware, Patricia explained, consulting notes on an expensive tablet. The banking relationships in the Cayman Islands are now fully operational, and we've got clean documentation for moving funds offshore. Each team should be able to process at least $50,000 per month through the new channels. The numbers she was discussing represented not just money but destroyed lives, ruined credit scores, and shattered trust. Every dollar they were laundering had been stolen from women who'd believed they were in loving relationships with men, who actually saw them as nothing more than sources of fraud-worthy personal information. The younger couple, introduced as Marcus and Stephanie, were apparently the technology specialists. They discussed hacking techniques, identity monitoring evasion, and methods for creating synthetic identities that could pass increasingly sophisticated verification systems. Their casual expertise with criminal technology was disturbing, but also valuable intelligence for building a case against the entire network. The new identity verification systems are getting harder to bypass, Marcus explained, but we've developed workarounds for most of the major credit monitoring services. The key is layering false information gradually over time, building a believable profile instead of trying to create one all at once. As I listened to their detailed discussion of criminal techniques, I realized that I was documenting something that could destroy their entire operation. The evidence I was gathering wasn't just sufficient for prosecuting Ryan and Jessica. It could bring down a criminal network that was systematically victimizing women across multiple states. But I also understood that the sophistication of their operation meant that traditional law enforcement approaches might not be sufficient to stop them permanently. These weren't amateur criminals who would be deterred by arrests and prosecutions. They were professionals who'd already planned for legal challenges and had resources to fight cases or flee jurisdiction if necessary. The meeting continued for over 3 hours, covering topics that ranged from victim identification to money laundering to expansion into new geographic markets. By the end of the evening, I had recordings and photographs that documented a criminal conspiracy worth millions of dollars and affecting potentially hundreds of victims. As the participants began leaving Jessica's apartment, I felt a mixture of triumph and cold determination. The evidence I'd gathered would be sufficient to bring serious federal charges against everyone involved, but I also understood that justice delivered through the courts might not provide the kind of consequences that would truly deter future crimes. The final phase of my plan began to crystallize as I packed up my surveillance equipment. These people had spent years perfecting techniques for destroying women's lives while hiding behind legal protections and sophisticated criminal infrastructure. They'd calculated that the risks of prosecution were manageable compared to the profits they could generate from systematic fraud. What they hadn't calculated was the possibility that one of their victims might evolve into someone capable of fighting back using methods that circumvented the legal protections they relied on. They'd underestimated the transformation that could occur when someone lost everything they'd trusted and loved, leaving them with nothing but determination to ensure justice was served. The next morning, I began implementing the final phase of my campaign against Ryan, Jessica, and their criminal network. The evidence I'd gathered would be used strategically, not just to support prosecutions, but to systematically destroy the infrastructure that allowed their crimes to continue. My first target was their financial network. Using the information I'd recorded about their offshore accounts and shell companies, I began feeding carefully crafted intelligence to federal agencies that specialized in financial crimes. The tips I provided were detailed enough to trigger investigations, but anonymous enough to protect my own involvement. Simultaneously, I started a coordinated campaign to warn their potential victims. The list of target profiles I'd obtained from Lisa's documents, combined with the expansion plans I'd overheard during surveillance, gave me names and contact information for dozens of women who were at risk. Each warning I provided was carefully crafted to seem like a concerned citizen's tip rather than part of a coordinated campaign. The response to my victim warnings was immediate and gratifying. Women across Colorado and neighboring states began reporting suspicious contact attempts, declining to provide personal information to charming men who matched Ryan's profile, and alerting authorities to potential fraud attempts. The network's victim pool was shrinking rapidly as word spread through professional communities about the specific techniques being used to target them. But the most satisfying aspect of my campaign was the psychological warfare I began conducting against Ryan and Jessica personally. Using the surveillance techniques I'd learned and the insider information Lisa continued to provide, I began a systematic campaign to make them understand that someone was watching their every move and documenting their every crime. The evidence of my presence started small. Photographs of their meetings left where they would find them, anonymous tips about their activities sent to their legitimate business contacts, subtle indications that their private conversations were being monitored. I wanted them to feel the same paranoia and helplessness that I'd experienced when I'd discovered the scope of their betrayal. Ryan's response to the psychological pressure was exactly what I'd hoped for. His natural arrogance and need for control made him incapable of accepting that someone might be outmaneuvering him. Instead of retreating or becoming more cautious, he escalated his activities while becoming increasingly sloppy in his operational security. Jessica proved more dangerous in her response to pressure. Where Ryan became reckless, she became calculating, apparently recognizing that they were facing a more sophisticated adversary than they'd encountered before. Her attempts to identify and neutralize the threat against them showed tactical intelligence that made her a formidable opponent. The psychological campaign reached its peak when I arranged for Ryan to discover that his contingency plan for discrediting me had been compromised. Using Lisa as an intermediary, I made sure he found evidence that someone had accessed his most private documents and understood his most sensitive strategies. The paranoia and fear that discovery generated was visible in his behavior within days. The final confrontation came sooner than I'd expected, precipitated by Ryan's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. He'd traced enough of the pressure back to me to understand that I was the source of his problems, but he still didn't comprehend the full scope of what he was facing. The meeting he requested was held at Union Station, a public location where he presumably felt safe from whatever retaliation he imagined I might be planning. When I arrived, I found him looking haggard and desperate, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious stress and fear. "Emma, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying none of the charm that had once made me believe he loved me. "I know you've been interfering with my business, and I need you to understand the consequences if you don't stop." The threat was delivered with enough venom to make his intentions clear, but I felt no fear. The woman he was threatening was someone who no longer existed. In her place was someone who'd spent weeks planning for exactly this moment. Someone who understood that Ryan's desperation made him more dangerous, but also more vulnerable. "I'm not interfering with your business, Ryan," I replied calmly. "I'm destroying it. And I'm not going to stop until you and everyone in your network are facing the full consequences of what you've done to innocent people." His face contorted with rage as he realized that I wasn't going to be intimidated or negotiated with. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he snarled. "This isn't just about money anymore. There are people involved who won't hesitate to hurt you if you continue threatening their operations." The escalation to physical threats was expected but still chilling. Ryan had moved beyond financial crimes into territory that could involve violence against anyone who threatened his criminal enterprise. But his threats also revealed desperation and loss of control, emotions that could be exploited by someone who remained calm and strategic. "I'm dealing with criminals who steal women's identities to fund luxury lifestyles," I said, my voice steady despite the gravity of his threat. "I'm dealing with predators who view other human beings as resources to be exploited. And I'm dealing with someone who's about to discover that some victims don't stay victims." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Ryan alternating between threats, pleas, and attempts at negotiation. He offered to pay back the money he'd stolen, to leave town permanently, to provide information about other criminal networks. Anything to stop the systematic destruction of his operation that I'd been orchestrating. But I'd moved beyond seeking personal restitution or even traditional justice. The scope of their crimes and the number of victims involved meant that simple prosecution or financial recovery wasn't sufficient. The only acceptable outcome was the complete dismantling of their criminal network, and consequences severe enough to deter similar crimes in the future. When Ryan finally realized that I couldn't be threatened, bribed, or reasoned with, his mask slipped completely. The charming real estate agent who'd swept me off my feet disappeared, replaced by someone cold and vicious enough to systematically destroy women's lives for profit. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice carrying genuine menace. "You think you're clever, but you're just a school teacher playing games with people who've been doing this professionally for years. This isn't over." As he walked away from our meeting, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond personal satisfaction. The confrontation had confirmed everything I'd learned about Ryan's true nature, while demonstrating how completely I'd evolved from the naive woman he'd victimized. The threats he'd made were concerning but not unexpected, and I'd already prepared for the possibility that he might escalate to violence. The final phase of my campaign against Ryan and Jessica's network was implemented over the following week. The federal investigations I'd triggered reached critical mass, with coordinated raids on their financial infrastructure and arrests of key network members. The victim warnings I distributed had created a protective network of informed women who were actively helping authorities identify and prevent additional crimes. Most satisfying was watching Ryan and Jessica's personal relationship crumble under the pressure of their collapsing criminal enterprise. The mutual trust and partnership that had seemed so strong during their crimes dissolved rapidly when they began facing serious consequences. Jessica was the first to seek a plea agreement with prosecutors, apparently deciding that loyalty to Ryan was less important than minimizing her own prison sentence. Ryan's arrest came on a Tuesday morning while he was showing a property to unsuspecting clients. The federal agents who took him into custody charged him with multiple counts of identity theft, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The evidence package that supported those charges included recordings from my surveillance, financial documents from Lisa's intelligence gathering, and testimony from victims across multiple states. The collapse of their criminal network was swift and comprehensive. Within 2 weeks of Ryan's arrest, every major participant had been charged with federal crimes carrying sentences measured in decades rather than years. The offshore accounts were frozen, the shell companies were dissolved, and the infrastructure that had supported their crimes was dismantled by federal investigators. As I watched the news coverage of their arrests and the expanding investigation into their criminal network, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal revenge. The women who'd been victimized would receive justice and financial recovery. The women who'd been targeted but not yet victimized were protected. And the criminal techniques that had been used against us were now known to law enforcement agencies that could prevent similar crimes in the future. The resolution of my personal case was almost anticlimactic compared to the broader impact of bringing down the entire network. The credit card companies restored my financial standing once the fraudulent accounts were proven to be identity theft. The damage to my credit score was repaired through victim assistance programs. The money that had been stolen from me was recovered through asset forfeiture from Ryan and Jessica's accounts. But the most important outcome wasn't financial or legal, it was personal. The woman who'd been victimized by sophisticated criminals had evolved into someone capable of protecting herself and others from similar threats. The transformation from naive victim to strategic protector was complete, and the skills I'd developed during my campaign for justice would serve me well in whatever challenges the future might bring. As I stood in my apartment 6 months after discovering Ryan's betrayal, looking out over the Denver skyline that had once seemed indifferent to my suffering, I realized that the person I'd become was someone I could respect and admire. The trusting teacher who'd believed in the goodness of people was gone, but in her place was someone who understood that protecting goodness sometimes required fighting evil with methods that good people preferred not to contemplate. The journey from victim to victor had cost me my innocence and my faith in simple solutions to complex problems. But it had given me something more valuable: the knowledge that I was capable of protecting myself and others from predators who viewed human suffering as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of profit. Ryan and Jessica had thought they were destroying a schoolteacher's life for their own benefit. Instead, they'd created someone who understood that justice isn't always delivered by institutions. Sometimes it has to be created by individuals who refuse to accept that criminal behavior should go unpunished. They'd made the mistake of underestimating someone they'd viewed as weak and naive, and that mistake had cost them everything they'd built on the foundation of other people's suffering. The final chapter of my story wasn't about revenge or destruction. It was about transformation and growth. The woman I'd become was someone who could build a life based on strength rather than trust. Someone who could protect others while protecting herself. Someone who understood that true security came not from believing in other people's goodness, but from being capable of defending against their evil. The morning I walked into the offices of Sterling Victim Advocacy Foundation, the nonprofit organization I'd established using the recovered funds from Ryan's criminal network, I felt a profound sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for months. The gleaming office space in downtown Denver's financial district was a far cry from the elementary school classroom where I'd once believed my future lay, but it represented something more valuable than any career I'd previously imagined: the power to protect other women from the devastation I'd experienced. The foundation had grown beyond my wildest expectations in the 8 months since Ryan and Jessica's criminal network had collapsed. What had started as a personal mission for justice had evolved into a comprehensive support system for victims of financial fraud and identity theft. We provided legal assistance, credit restoration services, psychological counseling, and most importantly, the kind of strategic intelligence that could help women fight back effectively against sophisticated criminals. My assistant, Rebecca Martinez, was herself a survivor of a romance scam that had cost her $60,000 and nearly destroyed her nursing career. When she'd first walked into my office 6 months ago, she'd been broken in the same way I'd once been, devastated by betrayal, financially ruined, and convinced that she'd been irreparably naive for trusting someone who'd systematically destroyed her life. Now she was one of our most effective advocates, using her experience to help other women navigate the complex process of recovering from financial fraud. Emma, We've got 3 new cases this morning, Rebecca said as I settled into my office overlooking the bustling streets of downtown Denver. 2 romance scams, and 1 case that looks like it might be connected to that credit card ring we've been tracking in Colorado Springs. Her efficiency and dedication were remarkable. But what impressed me most was how she'd transformed her own trauma into a weapon for protecting others. The Colorado Springs connection was particularly interesting because it suggested that Ryan and Jessica's arrest hadn't eliminated the broader criminal ecosystem they'd been part of. New networks were emerging, using similar techniques but adapting to avoid the enforcement strategies that had brought down the original operation. Staying ahead of these evolving threats required constant vigilance and sophisticated intelligence gathering. Our first client of the day was Maria Rodriguez, a social worker from Lakewood whose story was heartbreakingly familiar. She'd met someone through a professional networking event who'd seemed perfect, charming, successful, interested in her work with underserved communities. Over 6 months, he'd gradually gained access to her financial information, while building what she'd believed was a genuine romantic relationship. I should have known something was wrong when he insisted on handling our shared expenses, Maria said, tears streaming down her face as she recounted her experience. But he seemed so caring, so protective. He said he wanted to take care of me because my social work was so important. I thought I'd finally found someone who valued what I did for a living instead of seeing it as a limitation. The manipulation techniques Maria described were almost identical to what Ryan had used on me, but refined and updated based on lessons learned from previous operations. The criminals had become more sophisticated in their emotional manipulation, more careful about digital security, and more strategic about victim selection. Fighting them required constantly evolving our own methods and understanding. Maria, nothing about this is your fault, I told her firmly, recognizing the self-blame that had once consumed me. These people are professionals who study psychology and human behavior to perfect their techniques. They specifically target kind, caring people like social workers because they know you're naturally inclined to trust and help others. Your compassion isn't a weakness. It's exactly what makes you valuable to your community. The work of helping fraud victims was emotionally demanding but deeply rewarding. Every woman who walked through our doors was facing the same crisis of faith in their own judgment that I'd experienced. They'd been systematically manipulated by people who understood exactly how to exploit their best qualities: their trust, their generosity, their desire for meaningful relationships. But the Foundation's work went beyond individual victim assistance. We'd become a clearinghouse for intelligence about emerging fraud schemes, working closely with federal law enforcement agencies to identify and disrupt criminal networks before they could victimize more women. The surveillance and investigation skills I'd developed during my campaign against Ryan had proven invaluable in this broader mission. Detective Sarah Johnson from the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit had become a regular collaborator, sharing information about new cases and consulting with us about investigation strategies. Emma, your foundation has probably prevented more fraud in the past 8 months than we prevented in the previous 5 years, she'd told me during our most recent meeting. The intelligence you're gathering and the victim education you're providing are changing how we approach these crimes. The success of our work had attracted attention from beyond Colorado. I'd been invited to speak at conferences across the country, sharing the techniques we'd developed for victim advocacy and criminal network disruption. These speaking engagements had connected me with other survivors who were building their own organizations, creating a national network of people who understood that protecting innocent people sometimes required methods that weren't taught in traditional criminal justice programs. One of the most satisfying aspects of the Foundation's growth was hiring other survivors who'd transformed their trauma into expertise. Like Rebecca, many of our staff members were women who'd been victimized by sophisticated financial crimes and had chosen to dedicate their recovery to preventing similar crimes against others. Their combination of personal experience and professional dedication made them uniquely effective at both supporting victims and identifying emerging threats. The financial model for the Foundation was sustainable and growing. The asset forfeiture from Ryan and Jessica's network had provided initial funding, but we'd also received grants from federal agencies that recognized the value of our work. Private donations came from grateful clients whose lives we'd helped rebuild, and from wealthy individuals who understood that financial fraud was a threat that could affect anyone regardless of their resources or sophistication. My personal transformation over the past year had been as dramatic as the foundation's growth. The naive teacher who'd trusted blindly and been devastated by betrayal was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that protecting goodness required understanding evil. I'd learned to read people's motivations, to identify inconsistencies in their stories, to protect myself while still maintaining the capacity for meaningful relationships. The romantic relationship I'd begun 6 months ago with David Chen, a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, was built on a foundation completely different from what I'd shared with Ryan. David knew exactly who I'd become and why I'd evolved into someone who approached relationships with careful assessment rather than blind trust. Our connection was based on mutual respect for each other's strength, rather than one person's vulnerability to another's manipulation. "You've become someone who can take care of herself," David had said during one of our early conversations about my transformation. "That doesn't make you less capable of love. It makes you capable of healthy love between equals, instead of the predatory relationship you escaped." The psychological work of rebuilding my capacity for trust while maintaining appropriate caution had been challenging but ultimately successful. I'd learned to distinguish between reasonable skepticism and paranoid suspicion, between protecting myself and isolating myself. The therapy I'd undergone wasn't just about healing from trauma. It was about integrating the strength I'd developed with the capacity for connection that made life meaningful. The elementary school where I'd once taught had invited me back several times to speak with teachers about recognizing signs of financial manipulation in their own lives and in the lives of their students' families. These presentations were emotionally difficult but important, connecting my personal experience to the broader mission of education and protection. Children often know more about their family's financial stress than adults realize, I'd explained during my most recent visit to Pine Valley Elementary. Teaching them about healthy relationships and financial boundaries isn't just about their future. It's about recognizing when the adults in their lives might be experiencing manipulation or abuse. The ripple effects of my transformation extended far beyond the Foundation's direct work. Media coverage of our success had inspired other survivors to speak out about their experiences, creating a national conversation about romance scams and financial fraud that was changing how people approached online dating and financial relationships. Ryan's trial had concluded 3 months ago, with convictions on all counts and a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Jessica had received 12 years after cooperating with prosecutors to provide information about other criminal networks. The other members of their operation had received sentences ranging from 8 to 20 years, effectively dismantling the entire organization. During the sentencing hearing, I'd chosen to deliver a victim impact statement that focused not on the personal damage they'd caused me but on the broader harm their crimes had inflicted on the community. "Your Honor, these defendants didn't just steal money," I'd said, addressing the federal judge who would determine their sentences. "They stole something more valuable. They stole women's faith in their own judgment and their ability to form meaningful relationships. The financial damage can be repaired, but the psychological damage affects every relationship these women will have for the rest of their lives." The judge had referenced my statement in explaining the severity of the sentences he imposed, noting that financial fraud cases often failed to account for the psychological and social damage that extended far beyond monetary losses. The precedent set by their convictions had been cited in subsequent cases across the country, strengthening the legal framework for prosecuting romance scams and identity theft. Lisa Parker had become an unexpected ally in the Foundation's work, using her insider knowledge of criminal psychology to help develop profiles of potential perpetrators. Her decision to testify against her own brother had been difficult but crucial for securing convictions against the entire network. Her guilt about her initial silence had motivated her to become one of our most dedicated volunteers. "I can't undo the months I stayed quiet while Ryan was destroying your life," Lisa had said during one of our regular strategy meetings. "But I can make sure my knowledge of how these criminals think and operate is used to protect other women from similar victimization." The Foundation's research department had identified patterns in financial fraud that were helping law enforcement agencies develop more effective prevention strategies. We documented how criminals selected victims, how they built trust and emotional dependency, and how they structured their operations to avoid detection. This research was being used to train police officers, federal agents, and victim advocates across the country. Our educational programs had reached thousands of women through workshops, online resources, and community partnerships. The most popular program was called Trust But Verify, which taught women how to maintain healthy skepticism without becoming paranoid or isolated. The curriculum covered practical skills like verifying someone's identity and background, protecting personal financial information, and recognizing manipulation techniques. The personal satisfaction I derived from this work went far beyond professional accomplishment. Every woman we helped rebuild her life after financial fraud, every criminal network we helped law enforcement disrupt, every potential victim we educated about emerging threats, all of it represented a form of justice that was more meaningful than any legal verdict. The Emma Collins who'd discovered her fiancé's betrayal 18 months ago would never have imagined becoming someone capable of building an organization that protected hundreds of women from sophisticated criminals. But that naive teacher had possessed qualities, intelligence, determination, compassion, that became powerful weapons when channeled toward justice rather than victimization. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, Rebecca handed me a letter that had arrived from a woman in Phoenix, whose case we'd helped resolve 6 months ago. "Dear Emma," the letter began, "I wanted you to know that I got engaged last weekend to someone who loves and respects me exactly as I am. A year ago, I thought I'd never trust anyone again after what happened with the man who stole my identity. Your foundation didn't just help me get my money back, you helped me believe that I could have healthy relationships again. Thank you for showing me that survival could become strength." Reading that letter reminded me why the transformation from victim to protector had been worth every difficult moment of the journey. The woman I'd become was someone who could build meaningful relationships while maintaining the strength to protect herself and others from those who would exploit kindness and trust. The Denver skyline glittered outside my office windows as I gathered my things and prepared to meet David for dinner. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to turn other women's trauma into strength. The foundation was expanding into 3 new states, our research was influencing federal policy on financial fraud, and our victim services were becoming a model for organizations across the country. But tonight, I was simply Emma Collins, no longer the naive teacher who'd been easy prey for sophisticated criminals, and not yet the national advocate for fraud victims that I was becoming. I was someone who'd learned that true security came not from trusting blindly, but from being strong enough to defend against betrayal, while still remaining open to genuine connection. The journey from victim to victor had cost me my innocence but given me something more valuable, the knowledge that I was capable of protecting myself and others from predators who viewed human suffering as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of profit. Ryan and Jessica had thought they were destroying a schoolteacher's life for their own benefit. Instead, they'd created someone who understood that justice isn't always delivered by institutions. Sometimes it has to be created by individuals who refuse to accept that criminal behavior should go unpunished. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.